The Spider and the Silver Spoon, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with two peculiar things found side by side: a spider's web stretched across a dining room corner, and a silver spoon left where it should not have been. In St. Mary Mead, neither would seem important on its own, but together they catch Miss Marple's attention at once. The household insists nothing is wrong, just dust, neglect, and a misplaced piece of silver. But Miss Marple notices the details others ignore: the web freshly disturbed, the spoon polished too recently, and the uneasy way certain questions are avoided. A spider builds patiently, a spoon serves quietly, yet both, in their own way, can reveal what happened in that room. As Miss Marple follows these small and curious clues, she begins to unravel a carefully spun deception, one designed to keep the truth hidden in plain sight. Because in St. Mary Mead, even the smallest things can point to murder. Before we uncover the truth behind the spider and the silver spoon, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1. The Web in the Dining Room. The village of Stony Heath was the sort of place where nothing ever seemed to happen, and yet everyone behaved as though something dreadful might happen at any minute. It sat under low grey skies, with narrow lanes and crooked hedges, and old houses that seemed to lean together, sharing secrets. If a gate creaked in the night, someone heard it. If a light burned late in an upstairs room, someone noticed. And if a rich old man died suddenly, well, the whole village fed on it for weeks. Mr. Lionel Weatherbe was that sort of rich old man, sharp-faced, sharp-tempered, and tighter with money than a fist around a coin. He lived in Weatherbe Hall, a gloomy brick house at the edge of the village, with windows that looked like watching eyes. People respected him, if only because he held half the village's debts in his desk drawer. But liking him, that was another thing entirely. Lionel Weatherbe had a talent for making enemies, quietly, slowly, like rust spreading over silver. Miss Marple first heard of his death the next morning, just after breakfast, when Mrs. Potts came hurrying through her garden gate with the kind of excitement that only bad news could bring. "Dead," Mrs. Potts whispered, though there was no one near enough to hear. "Dead in his study, and they say it's all very strange." Miss Marple looked up from trimming her roses. Strange deaths often are. Mrs. Potts leaned closer, lowering her voice as though the flowers might gossip. Lionel Weatherbe had gone into his study after supper, as he always did, carrying his nightly sherry. The house went quiet by 10. By morning, the butler found him slumped in his chair, stiff and cold, staring at the fireplace as though he'd seen something awful in the final seconds. Miss Marple listened, calm as ever, but one detail made her pause. "A silver spoon?" she asked. Mrs. Potts nodded quickly. On the desk beside him, tied round with black thread, like some sort of warning. That was queer. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that murderers often fancied themselves clever. They liked symbols, little jokes, private meanings, things meant to confuse. But there was more. Above the fireplace, hanging from the carved wooden frame of an old hunting painting, was a fresh spider's web, thick strands catching the morning light, right above where Lionel Weatherbe had died. A small thing, perhaps, but small things mattered. By noon the village was alive with talk. Some said poison, Others said fright. One woman claimed the dead man had been cursed, which Miss Marple dismissed at once. Curses were for stories, murder was for people. And there were plenty of people in Weatherbe Hall. Clara Weatherbe, his niece who stood to inherit everything if the will remained unchanged, a nervous girl, pretty enough, but worn thin by years of living under her uncle's hard eye. Mr. Finch, the butler, who'd served Lionel for 20 years and looked as though he'd swallowed every opinion he'd ever had. Elsie Trent, the young housemaid, red-eyed and trembling since the body was found. And Dr. Bell, who dined with Lionel the evening before and claimed the man had seemed in perfect health. Perfect health, dead by dawn. Miss Marple sat by her window that evening, knitting untouched in her lap, staring into the dark garden and turning it in her mind. A silver spoon tied with black thread, a spider's web over the fireplace, and a dead man who had enemies in every corner of his own house. No struggle, no broken glass, no cries in the night, just silence. That was what bothered her, because houses like Weatherbe Hall creaked and sighed and muttered in the dark. They never stayed truly silent, unless everyone was listening for one thing, the moment Lionel Weatherbe stopped breathing. And somewhere in that house, Miss Marple felt it certain, someone had been waiting, calm as a spider in its web, for the trap to close. Chapter 2. The Silver Spoon and the Secret Thread. Miss Marple arrived at Weatherbe Hall the following afternoon, carrying nothing but her gloves and her usual gentle expression, the sort that made people think she'd come only to offer comfort. It was useful being underestimated. People relaxed around her. They talked too freely. And in houses where death had just paid a visit, loose talk was often worth more than evidence. The moment she stepped inside, she felt it. Not grief, not exactly. The house felt strained, like a violin string pulled too tight. The silence wasn't natural. It was the kind of silence people made when they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. The great hallway smelled of floor polish and cold stone, and somewhere deeper in the house a clock ticked so loudly it felt almost rude. Mr. Finch, the butler, showed her in. His face was stiff as carved wood, his voice dry as paper. 20 years in service had trained him well, but Miss Marple had spent her life studying people, and she noticed the little things. His collar was fastened wrong by one button, a tiny mistake, the sort of mistake made by a man whose thoughts were somewhere else. Clara Weatherbe was waiting in the morning room, pale as cream, and twisting her handkerchief in her lap. She looked tired, but there was something else under it, nervousness, sharp, restless nervousness. "It's all so dreadful," Clara said. "I still can't believe it." Miss Marple gave her a kind nod and sat opposite her. The room smelled faintly of cold tea and fading flowers. Nobody had touched the tray beside the window. "Your uncle had his habits, I imagine," Miss Marple said. Clara nodded. "Always the same. Supper at 8, study by 9, sherry before bed." Routine. Miss Marple always trusted routine. It was when routine broke that trouble began. Her eyes drifted to the fireplace mantel, where the silver spoon had been placed after the inspector's examination. It was an old piece, polished bright despite its age, but the black thread tied around its handle looked ugly against it, like dirt on clean linen. "Do you know why it was there?" Miss Marple asked. Clara shook her head. No, Uncle hated anyone touching the silver. That caught her attention. Hated anyone touching it. so whoever placed it there had either been bold or expected to be there. Miss Marple asked about the household, and the answers came carefully, too carefully. Clara admitted her uncle had quarreled with nearly everyone. He'd changed his will more than once, using money as a weapon. Promises one day, threats the next. Clara herself had once been his heir, until an argument 6 months ago had reduced her share to almost nothing. Money. There it was, the oldest poison in the world. Later, Dr. Bell arrived, having called in to see how Clara was bearing up. He was a solid-looking man, calm, tidy, respectable, the sort of man villagers trusted without question. He dined with Lionel on the final evening and claimed the old man was perfectly himself, sharp as ever, if a bit sour-tempered. He complained of stomach pain after supper, Bell said, but that was unusual. Miss Marple watched him closely. His voice stayed steady enough, but when she mentioned the silver spoon, his eyes shifted. Just a flicker, quick, barely there. But quick things can matter. A blink, a pause, a glance. That's where truth leaks out. In the kitchen, Miss Marple found Elsie, the housemaid, scrubbing the same plate over and over, though it was already clean. Her hands shook. "You heard something that night?" Miss Marple asked softly. Elsie looked around before speaking, as though the walls themselves might report her. "Footsteps, miss, in the passage by the study, slow-like, late, past midnight." Miss Marple frowned. That didn't fit. Everyone believed Lionel had died hours earlier. If footsteps were heard after midnight, then someone was moving near the study long after the house had settled. Someone checking, or someone finishing what they'd started. Before leaving, Miss Marple asked to see the study. It was dark even in daylight, the curtains heavy, the furniture heavy, the whole room heavy with the last breath of its owner. Lionel Weatherbe's chair still sat by the desk, pushed slightly back, as though he'd risen suddenly or meant to. Miss Marple stood still, letting the room speak, and then her eyes lifted. The spider's web, still hanging above the fireplace, untouched. At first glance it looked ordinary enough, but caught in one silk strand was something tiny, a thread, black, the same as the thread tied to the spoon. Miss Marple stepped closer, her old eyes sharp as needles. That was no accident. The spoon and the web belonged together, and that meant the killer hadn't left a warning. He'd left part of the method. A clever little trick, almost too clever. But clever people often make the worst mistakes, because they think no one else will see the thread they've left hanging. And Miss Marple had just found it. Chapter 3. The Spider in the Silver. Miss Marple spent that evening by her fire, knitting resting untouched in her lap, her mind working harder than her hands ever could. The silver spoon, the black thread, the spider's web above the fireplace. 3 small things, separate at first glance. But murder was never made of grand things. It was stitched together from small ones, tiny mistakes, tiny habits, tiny lies. By morning, she asked Inspector Hale to gather everyone at Weatherbe Hall. Clara came first, pale and restless, her eyes hollow from another sleepless night. Finch stood near the door, stiff and silent as ever, his face giving away nothing. Elsie hovered in the corner, looking as though she'd bolt if anyone raised their voice. Dr. Bell arrived last, neat as always, coat buttoned, expression calm. Too calm. The study felt colder with all of them inside. Miss Marple stood beside Lionel Weatherby's desk, her hands folded lightly, looking less like an investigator and more like someone discussing the weather. That was her way, soft voice, sharp mind. "The answer," she said quietly, "was in the spoon." Inspector Hale frowned. "The spoon?" Miss Marple nodded and picked it up carefully. "Silver tarnishes quickly if it touches certain poisons. Lionel Weatherby was poisoned, yes, but not in his supper, in his sherry." Dr. Bell shifted his weight. A small movement, but Miss Marple saw it. "The spoon," she went on, "was used to stir the drink. The poison left its mark. That black thread tied around it wasn't decoration. It was meant to hang inside the glass." Inspector Hale blinked. "Why?" "To deliver the poison slowly." Silence. Heavy silence. Miss Marple pointed toward the spider's web above the fireplace. "And when the glass was emptied, the thread was removed and caught in the web. That was the mistake. The killer thought no one would connect it." Dr. Bell's face had gone pale now, not with grief, with fear. Miss Marple turned to him. "You knew Lionel trusted you. You dined with him. You poured the sherry. And you knew something else. He was about to cut you from his will." Clara gasped. Inspector Hale stared. "Dr. Bell was in the will." Miss Marple nodded. "A private loan, a very large one. Lionel discovered Bell had been stealing medicine and selling it quietly in nearby towns. He threatened to expose him." Bell's jaw tightened. The neat manners cracked at last. "He ruined lives, mine included." "There it is," Miss Marple said softly. "The truth always came out ugly." Bell lunged for the door, but Finch blocked him, solid as stone, and Inspector Hale seized him just 2 steps. Just like that. Finished. The spider caught. Later, as Bell was taken away, Clara sat trembling in the empty study, staring at the chair where her uncle had died. "It feels strange, knowing it's over," she whispered. "Nothing is ever quite over, my dear. Houses remember." Outside, the evening settled over Stony Heath, quiet again, as though the village had folded the secret back into itself. But Miss Marple knew better. Villagers never forgot. They stored stories the way old cupboards stored dust, and some stories clung, like silk thread in a web. If you've enjoyed this mystery and want to follow more of Miss Marple's strangest cases, make sure to subscribe, leave your thoughts below, and stay close, because the next quiet little village may already be hiding its next murder. And somewhere, even now, another spider might be waiting.